Loneliness is one of those invisible companions that everyone at some point feels. Sometimes it appears as a void that seems to have no name, other times as a weight that suffocates, and, in more subtle cases, as a constant restlessness that we cannot explain. You don't have to be physically alone to feel it. Being surrounded by people and yet realizing that no one really sees us, hears us, or understands us is one of the most painful manifestations of this state. She doesn't scream, but her presence is deafening, echoing what's deepest in our soul, the desire for connection. Carl Jung said that loneliness arises when we become incapable of communicating what we feel is essential within us. This sentence reveals something disconcerting. Loneliness does not only depend on the external world, but on an internal imbalance. We can be in an environment full of conversations and still feel like there is no place for our words, for our true self. This is because loneliness is manifested not only by the lack of company, but by the abyss we feel between who we are and what the world expects us to be. Think of loneliness as a shadow. It is present in the most memorable moments of our existence. The first day at a new school, when we move to a different city, or after the loss of someone we love deeply. It arises in those moments of transition, where we are forced to leave a known version of ourselves and embrace the uncertainty of the unknown. And we often resist this shadow, trying to fill it with distractions, social media, excessive work, meaningless commitments. But the more we run away, the more it grows, becoming a vicious cycle of disconnection and emptiness. Imagine a man who, after losing his wife, realizes that his life has lost its luster. The house that was once full of conversations, laughter, and plans became a cold place where every corner seemed to echo her absence. He woke up every day with the feeling that he was living on autopilot, as if his existence had been reduced to a sequence of mechanical gestures. The people around him tried to help him, but he closed himself off, feeling that no one would be able to understand the depth of his pain. It was as if there was an invisible barrier between him and the world, a barrier built by his own loneliness. Interestingly, loneliness can be both an enemy and a teacher. In ancient cultures, it was seen as a portal to self-knowledge. Monks and sages often sought isolation as a way to find answers that could not be achieved in the chaos of everyday life. However, for most of us, loneliness is not a deliberate choice, but an imposed condition, and so it can feel overwhelming. The difference is in how we experience it, as a sentence of suffering or as an opportunity to look inside and understand what really matters. Science also helps explain why loneliness can be so devastating. Research shows that our brains are wired to seek out social connections. The lack of genuine interactions activates areas linked to stress and physical pain, as if we were injured. This explains why feeling alone can be so exhausting and even harmful to your health. People who experience chronic loneliness are more likely to develop heart problems, depression, and even a shortened life expectancy. But that doesn't mean we're doomed to it. Loneliness, although painful, carries within it the potential for transformation, like a wound that, when healed, can make us stronger. Going back to that man's story, something began to change when he realized that he could no longer live that way. It wasn't a dramatic decision or a moment of sudden epiphany. It was a simple act of will. One morning, he decided to leave the house and walk. At first, it seemed like just an attempt to escape, but over time, those walks became a space where he could think, feel, and even begin to heal the invisible wounds he carried. He realized that loneliness, instead of being an insurmountable weight, could be the beginning of a new path. As paradoxical as it may seem, loneliness reminds us that we are human. It's a sign that something inside us longs for meaning, for connection, for belonging. Recognizing this is the first step to transforming it. But how to take this step? How do we start to get out of the labyrinth that it builds around us? This is where the story begins to expand, showing that even in the darkest moments, there is light waiting to be discovered. And this light often begins with the simple act of looking within. Loneliness is not just an emotional experience, it is deeply physical and psychological. When we immerse ourselves in this state, our body and mind begin to react in ways that we don't always notice right away. Science shows us that prolonged loneliness can be as harmful as addictions or chronic illnesses. And it's not just something abstract. The impact is real, palpable, and often devastating. Imagine the human body as a delicately balanced machine, where each part depends on the other to function fully. Loneliness, like a grain of sand, can infiltrate this system, disrupting its harmony. Studies indicate that people who feel chronically lonely have higher levels of the stress hormone cortisol. This continuous increase overloads the heart, raises blood pressure, and weakens the immune system. In essence, loneliness makes us more vulnerable to illnesses, from frequent colds to serious conditions like heart problems. It's as if the body understands loneliness as a state of constant threat, activating alarms that never go off. And then there is the mind. Loneliness often transforms our way of thinking and seeing the world. The brain, which evolved to seek social connections, reacts to the lack of them as if it were facing imminent danger. We begin to see threats where they do not exist, interpreting neutral interactions as rejections or judgments. It's as if loneliness places distorted lenses over our eyes, making every gesture, word, or silence proof that we don't belong. Think about that man in the story. When he lost the person he loved most, he began to experience not only an emotional void, but also physical and mental changes. He felt an inexplicable exhaustion, as if carrying his own body was a monumental effort. In the silence of his home, his mind replayed scenarios of guilt and regret, while sleep became a rare visitor. This cycle of thoughts and sensations imprisoned him, making it difficult to imagine any possibility of relief. Interestingly, there is an evolutionary reason for this. In ancient times, being isolated meant danger. A single individual was more vulnerable to predators and resource scarcity. Our brain, still programmed for those primitive times, perceives loneliness as a threat and responds with a constant state of alert. However, this response, which could save our lives in the past, today contributes to our suffering, intensifying feelings of anxiety and anguish. Loneliness, when ignored, can pave the way for even deeper problems. Studies link chronic loneliness to depression, cognitive decline, and even an increased risk of dementia in older adults. But you don't have to wait until old age to feel the impacts. Young adults, often connected virtually, report record levels of loneliness. It's as if we live in a hyper-connected and, at the same time, emotionally distant society. Despite all this, loneliness does not have to be a final destination. It carries within it the opportunity for transformation. When this man decided to take small steps to address his isolation, he began to reverse the damage that loneliness had caused. His morning walks, at first just a temporary relief, began to offer something more, a sense of purpose. Over time, he noticed small changes. His sleep improved, his energy returned, and his mind, previously so dark, began to see glimmers of hope. Still, the journey to overcoming the impact of loneliness is anything but linear. There are days when the weight seems to double, when the effort to connect seems futile. But these moments, as difficult as they are, also hold lessons. They remind us that loneliness is not something that simply disappears, but something we learn to live with and eventually transform. It is at this point that the question arises: if loneliness can be so harmful, what can we do to face it? The answer is not simple, but it starts with a change in perspective, and this change, as we will see, requires courage, small gestures of openness, and the willingness to explore unknown territory, but full of possibilities. The next step in this journey is the how to accept loneliness, how to transform it, and how to rediscover lost connection. The story is still far from over, and the path, although challenging, promises something profoundly liberating. Dealing with loneliness is like facing a vast unknown ocean. At first, the immensity is scary, and the waves seem uncontrollable. But little by little, we realize that there are ways to navigate these waters, even if at first the process seems slow and lonely. The first step to dealing with loneliness is not fighting it, but accepting it, recognizing its presence not as a sentence, but as a reflection that something needs to change, is essential to start building a new path. Acceptance, however, is often misunderstood. It doesn't mean resigning yourself to pain or giving up on seeking connection. Accepting loneliness is like opening the door to an unexpected visitor. You don't like his presence, but you understand that ignoring it won't make it go away. It is at this moment that we can begin to transform what seemed like an overwhelming experience into something that paradoxically can strengthen us. The story of that man illustrates this process well. After weeks in a cycle of isolation and sadness, he realized that trying to avoid loneliness only sank him deeper. So instead of running away, he decided to take her in. In a simple but deeply meaningful gesture, he began setting aside moments of his day to sit quietly, listening to his own thoughts. It wasn't easy. At first, these moments were filled with painful memories and an almost unbearable feeling of emptiness. But over time, he began to realize there was something more there, an opportunity to understand what really mattered in his life. In addition to acceptance, it is crucial to take small steps to transform loneliness into a driving force. For this man, that meant starting with something as simple as taking a morning walk. At first, walks were just a way to escape the weight of silence at home, but little by little, they became a self-care ritual. He began to notice the trees along the way, the sound of birds, and even exchange greetings with other hikers. These moments, although brief, planted the first seeds of reconnection with yourself and the world around you. Another important step was looking for ways to connect in a meaningful way with other people. He decided to volunteer at a nursing home, even though he didn't know exactly what to expect. The first few days were difficult. Listening to residents' stories of loss and pain felt like opening wounds he was desperately trying to close. But over time, he realized that these interactions not only helped him process his own pain, but also gave him a new sense of purpose. He began to realize that his presence made a difference in people's lives, and that helped him feel less alone. Science also reinforces the importance of these small actions. Studies show that simple gestures, such as going for a walk, helping someone, or just taking time to care for yourself, can reduce stress levels and improve our perception of connection with the world. The secret is in consistency. It's not about doing something grand, but about repeating small gestures that over time build a new foundation of balance. Dealing with loneliness also involves seeking authentic connections, something that often feels scary when we feel isolated. In a world where superficial interactions are abundant, finding relationships that allow us to express who we really are can be challenging, but it is essential. For this man, these connections came when he began to open up to others, not forcefully, but honestly. He learned that sharing his vulnerability didn't make him weak, but human, and in doing so, he discovered that many other people around him also carried their own loneliness. Although they rarely talked about it, every small gesture, every interaction, every moment of acceptance transformed that man's relationship with his loneliness. He did not become immune to it, but he learned to deal with its presence in a way that strengthened him rather than destroyed him. It is a process that requires patience and courage, but it also opens the door to real transformation. Still, accepting and dealing with loneliness is only part of the journey. Real change begins when we decide to go beyond, taking concrete steps to overcome this state and build a new sense of belonging. But how to do this? How can we transform these first steps into a solid path towards overcoming? This is where the journey deepens, revealing the possibilities that await us as we open ourselves to the next chapter. Overcoming loneliness is a journey that requires more than acceptance. She calls for action, even if shy and hesitant at first. It's like building a bridge over an abyss. Each step forward may seem small and insignificant, but over time we realize that the path is forming. The hardest thing is to start, especially when loneliness makes us believe we are stuck in the same place. However, it is exactly in these moments that the first gesture, however small, carries transformative power. The man in the story knew he needed to go beyond simply accepting loneliness. The morning walks he took, initially an escape, began to turn into something more. He decided to explore different paths, and one of those mornings, he found a small park where groups of people were walking together. He watched from a distance, feeling a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. Days later, he summoned the courage to join a group doing light exercise. No one directly asked why he was there or what he was looking for, but the simple fact of being among this made that morning lighter. It was the beginning of a new routine, and the repetition of these interactions planted the seed of belonging in him. Overcoming loneliness also means allowing yourself to try activities that connect us to the present and take us away from the weight of isolation. Volunteering was another important step in that man's life. After a few weeks in the nursing home, he realized that helping others helped him too. The residents' stories, full of loss and overcoming, gave him a new perspective on his own pain. He began to see that suffering was universal, but that there were still ways to move forward. That volunteering, which began as an attempt to keep busy, turned into a source of learning and inspiration. For many people, the path to overcoming loneliness may involve activities that seem simple but carry deep meaning. Joining a book club, signing up for art classes, or even taking up a hobby like gardening or music are ways to turn alone time into something productive and comforting. These actions help create an internal space where loneliness is not just absence, but also fertile ground for new discoveries. Support from other people, even strangers, can also be a crucial factor. Support groups and online communities emerge as an alternative for those who do not yet feel comfortable interacting in person. There are forums and social networks dedicated to connecting people facing similar challenges. While technology sometimes fuels loneliness, it can also be a bridge to meaningful connections when used mindfully. Many find these groups the first place where they feel they can be heard and understood. Therapy also plays an important role for those seeking to overcome loneliness. Having a safe space to express fears, anxieties, and vulnerabilities can be a powerful relief. A therapist can help identify patterns that perpetuate isolation and suggest strategies for breaking them. That man in the story, for example, started attending group therapy sessions at the nursing home where he volunteered. There, he realized that sharing his story not only helped him process the pain, but also encouraged others to do the same. It was in this environment that he began to understand the power of being heard and listening. Overcoming loneliness is a process of reconstruction. It's not about erasing what was experienced, but rather transforming isolation into a starting point. It is important to remember that this process does not follow a straight line. There will be days when loneliness seems to return with a vengeance, but it is precisely in these moments that the tools built along the way, connections, hobbies, self-care practices, will show their value. For that man, overcoming loneliness meant not only reconnecting with the world, but also rediscovering himself. He realized that loneliness had changed his perception of what was important. Small moments of joy, like a casual conversation or a quiet afternoon in the park, became sources of gratitude. And although he still carried the memory of the loss, it no longer defined him. He had found a new way of existing, one that included both space for pain and the possibility of connection and joy. But today's world presents unique challenges, especially with the growing role of technology in our lives. It can be both an ally and an obstacle to overcoming loneliness. How to navigate this territory? How to find balance between the real and the virtual. The journey continues with new possibilities and reflections on the role of technology in our human connections. Technology, with its promise to connect the world, presents a fascinating paradox. We have never been so interconnected, and at the same time, we have never felt so alone. For many, modern loneliness is fueled by screens that illuminate our faces, but don't always warm our hearts. The man in the story, like so many other people, discovered that isolation was not just a matter of physical absence, but also of how he interacted with the digital world around him. At the beginning of his journey, he spent hours swiping his finger across his cell phone screen, searching for something he never seemed to find. Photos of smiling friends, incredible trips, and seemingly perfect moments made him feel even more disconnected. The silent comparison with the lives he saw there reinforced his feeling of inadequacy. He began to realize that while social media promised connection, it often left him with an even greater void. It was like being in a room full of people, but feeling invisible. This phenomenon is not uncommon. Studies show that excessive use of social media can intensify feelings of loneliness, especially when the focus is on passively observing the lives of others. This superficial interaction gives us the illusion of companionship, but rarely meets our deep need for authentic connection. This is because our brain was designed for face-to-face interactions, where gestures, expressions, and even tone of voice play key roles. When we limit ourselves to digital messages or likes, something essential is lost. However, technology is not inherently villainous. It can also be a powerful tool for combating loneliness when used consciously. The man in the story began to discover this by exploring online communities focused on topics that interested him. He found a virtual group of people who shared their experiences of loss and loneliness. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone in his struggle. Although the interactions were digital, there was something genuine there, an exchange of stories, mutual support and understanding that he didn't find on conventional social media. The key to using technology as an ally is balance. It's important to limit the time spent on passive activities, like endlessly scrolling through social networks, and prioritize interactions that offer real value. Support groups, online classes, and even video conferences with friends or family are ways to use technology to create meaningful connections. The man in the story realized this when he started participating in online therapy sessions. Although reluctant at first, he discovered that it was possible to bond and share vulnerabilities even through a screen. Another strategy he adopted was intentional disconnection. At certain times of the day, he would turn off his cell phone and allow himself to be present in the physical world. He started cultivating little rituals, like drinking coffee without looking at his phone or walking in the park without headphones. These moments, although simple, brought him a sense of calm and clarity that he hadn't experienced in a long time. Interestingly, technology can also help facilitate a return to the physical world. Dating apps, community organizing platforms, and even online events that encourage in-person meetings can be starting points for those looking to build real-world connections. The man in the story, for example, used an app to find volunteer groups in his city, which eventually led him to work at the nursing home. Technology, in this case, was the bridge that helped him cross the abyss of loneliness. However, it is important to remember that technology is just a tool. It amplifies what we already carry within us. If we feel disconnected and isolated, it's easy to use it as an empty substitute for real connections. But if we seek intentionality and purpose, it can open doors to meaningful experiences. The man in the story learned to navigate this balance, using technology to reconnect with the world, but without getting lost in it. He discovered that the secret wasn't in abandoning screens altogether, but in using them as a means to an end, building deeper, more genuine connections, both in the digital space and beyond. Still, the challenge of loneliness goes beyond the individual. We live in a society that often reinforces isolation, promoting the idea that loneliness is a weakness or something to be avoided at all costs. How can we change this narrative? How can we create spaces and communities where loneliness is not a stigma, but a shared experience that unites us? The answer lies in looking beyond technology and starting to transform the social structures around us. Loneliness is often seen as an individual burden, something that each person must carry in silence, almost as if it were a reflection of personal failure. However, when we look closer, we realize that it is also a reflection of the society in which we live. We are surrounded by a world that values productivity over connection, independence over collaboration, and which often stigmatizes loneliness as something shameful. It is in this environment that loneliness finds fertile ground, not only manifesting itself, but taking deep root. The story of the lonely man is not an isolated case. She is a mirror of what many face on a daily basis. When he lost the person he loved, he noticed not only the emptiness in his home, but also how ill-equipped the world around him seemed to deal with his grief. Conversations were quick, interactions were superficial. He felt like there was no space to express his vulnerability, as if society demanded that he just move on. This silent pressure is something many face, especially in cultures that glorify strength and self-reliance. The stigma surrounding loneliness creates a dangerous cycle. Those who experience it often feel compelled to hide it, fearing judgment or rejection. This pushes them further into isolation, reinforcing the feeling of disconnection. Society, in turn, rarely offers safe spaces to discuss these feelings. Conversations about loneliness are often avoided, replaced by platitudes that don't touch on the depth of the problem. The result is a collective silence that fuels the growth of loneliness. But loneliness doesn't have to be taboo. It is a universal human experience, something we all face at some point. Recognizing this is the first step to creating change. The man in the story began to realize this during his work at the nursing home. There, he found people who did not hide their loneliness. On the contrary, they spoke openly about her. This honesty, far from pushing him away, created a space of empathy and connection. He saw how shared vulnerability could transform loneliness into something that united rather than divided. Creating more inclusive and compassionate communities is essential to combating loneliness on a collective level. This doesn't just mean promoting big social initiatives, but also encouraging small changes in our daily lives. Genuinely asking how someone is doing, offering a listening ear, or creating moments of authentic connection are simple but powerful gestures. The man in the story realized this when he began to exchange small words with neighbors he previously barely greeted. These seemingly trivial interactions became reminders that he was still part of a social fabric. Furthermore, we need to rethink the spaces we share. Many public places, such as parks, libraries, and community centers, have the potential to become meeting places for people seeking connection, but they are often underutilized or inaccessible. Investing in initiatives that promote encounters and interaction can make a significant difference. The nursing home where the man volunteered, for example, organized events open to the community, brought together young people of different ages and backgrounds. He realized that in these moments it was not just the isolation of the elderly that was being combated, but also his own. The role of education is also crucial. Teaching children and young people about the importance of expressing emotions, building healthy relationships, and dealing with loneliness constructively can have a profound impact on how society addresses these challenges in the future. Instead of teaching that loneliness is something to be feared or avoided, we can show that it is a natural part of life that carries valuable lessons about who we are and what we value. Finally, it is important to remember that transforming society regarding loneliness is not just an external responsibility, but a personal commitment. Every gesture of empathy, every moment of authentic connection contributes to creating a world where no one feels invisible. The story of the lonely man shows us that, although loneliness is often an individual journey, overcoming it is a collective achievement. But there are other times when loneliness becomes particularly challenging, such as aging, when changes in health, relationships, and routine make isolation even more present. How can we address these unique challenges? How can we create a sense of belonging even when life presents us with so many losses? The journey continues, now into a territory where loneliness is experienced in an even deeper and more complex way. In old age, loneliness takes different forms, but no less intense. As the years progress, life's inevitable changes make isolation a common experience for many people. Friends and loved ones may leave, health may weaken, and mobility may decrease. All of this contributes to the feeling of disconnection, as if the world around is moving too fast while the elderly person is trapped in a place of memories and silence. The man in the story realized this when he started volunteering at the nursing home. At first, he only saw the losses that these people carried, the absence of family, the lack of visitors, and even the way their voices seemed forgotten amid the noise of modern society. He met a lady called Donna Clara, who every day sat on the same bench in the garden, holding an old photograph. When he asked about the photo, she replied, "It's proof that one day I belonged to something." Dad, those words stayed with him, echoing as a reminder that loneliness in old age wasn't just about being alone, but about feeling like your story no longer had relevance. Loneliness at this stage of life is often underestimated, but its impact is profound. Research shows that seniors who experience chronic loneliness are at greater risk of developing depression, cognitive decline, and even heart disease. A lack of social interaction can accelerate the aging process, not just physically but emotionally, draining any remaining vitality. It's a difficult circle to break, as many elderly people, feeling rejected or forgotten, end up withdrawing even more. However, loneliness in old age does not have to be a final sentence. There are ways to address it, and they start with creating spaces where older people can reconnect with themselves and others. At the nursing home, the man saw how simple activities could make a huge difference. Group games, craft classes, and even story circles brought moments of joy and connection. He realized that although the pain of loneliness was still present, these moments gave many a reason to smile again. Another important aspect is the role of the family. Elderly people often feel like they are a burden to their loved ones, which leads them to avoid asking for attention or help. But simple gestures, such as a regular phone call, a visit, or even exchanging letters, can help rebuild bonds that have been weakened by time. For Donna Clara, her granddaughter's monthly visit was the highlight of her month. Although brief, that moment was a reminder that she still mattered to someone. Technology can also be an unexpected ally to combat loneliness in old age. Many older people, initially reluctant, discover that tools like video calls and online groups can be a way to connect with distant friends and family. At the nursing home, the man helped some residents learn to use tablets to talk to their children and grandchildren. He will never forget Donna Clara's smile when he saw his great-granddaughter's face on the screen for the first time. Technology, at that time, was not just an instrument, it was a bridge. But perhaps the most important key to facing loneliness in old age is recognition. Recognize that older people have stories, experiences, and wisdom that deserve to be heard. They often feel invisible in a society that prioritizes youth and productivity. Giving them space to share their memories and contribute their perspective is a powerful way to validate their importance. For the man in the story, his time at the nursing home not only helped the elderly, it helped him as well. He realized that by listening to the stories of Donna Clara and others, he was learning about human resilience. He saw how, even in the midst of loneliness, there was a strength that allowed these people to continue. It inspired him to look at his own journey with more compassion and hope. Still, loneliness is not limited to old age. It starts early, often in the younger years when emotional connections are still forming. What happens when children and teens face loneliness in a world that seems designed to distract them but not understand them? The next leg of this journey takes us into equally delicate territory, where loneliness meets young hearts and minds. Loneliness in childhood and adolescence is a deeply formative but often invisible experience. It's a kind of silent pain that can infiltrate early social interactions or emerge in the face of changes that challenge young people's emotional security. For a child, loneliness can seem incomprehensible, like an emptiness that he or she doesn't yet know how to name. For a teenager, it can be heavy anguish, a feeling of disconnection in a world that demands belonging at all costs. In the case of children, loneliness often arises in moments of transition, changing schools, separating from parents, or even the birth of a sibling. These changes, which seem a natural part of life, can be experienced as profound shocks to your perception of security and affection. Imagine a girl who, after moving to a new city, enters a classroom full of unfamiliar faces. She feels isolated, even though she's surrounded by voices and laughter. When he tries to speak, his voice seems small, and every attempt to connect is met with indifference. The feeling of not belonging begins to solidify, turning into an invisible wall. During adolescence, loneliness takes on a new layer of complexity. This is a period when the desire to be accepted is almost as important as breathing. But the connections young people build are not always deep or genuine. Social networks, so present at this stage, can worsen the problem. A teenager who sees photos of his peers at parties or trips may feel that his life is less meaningful, even if he knows that the networks only show carefully selected fragments. This constant comparison feeds a feeling of exclusion and insufficiency, leading many young people to close themselves off even more. Science confirms the lasting impact of loneliness at this stage of life. Children and teenagers who face loneliness for long periods can develop thinking patterns that follow them into adulthood, such as difficulty trusting others or fear of rejection. Furthermore, loneliness can affect school performance, self-esteem, and even mental health, being a common precursor to anxiety and depression. But not all is lost. There are ways to identify and deal with loneliness in younger generations, starting with something fundamental: attention. Signs of loneliness in children and teens often go unnoticed because we are too busy to notice. A child who constantly isolates himself at recess, or a teenager who spends hours in his room with the curtains closed, may be trying to communicate something without words. The first step is to open space for them to express what they feel without fear of judgment. For children, creating opportunities for positive interaction can make a huge difference. Activities that encourage teamwork, like sports or arts groups, help build connections organically. However, it is essential that these activities respect each child's time and space, allowing them to approach others at their own pace. For the girl who felt out of place at her new school, it was an invitation from a classmate to draw together that broke the ice and made her feel less invisible. With teens, honest dialogue is one of the most powerful tools. They need spaces where they feel heard and validated, without their experiences being minimized or treated as drama. Deal. A young person who trusts an adult, whether a parent, teacher, or mentor, is more likely to overcome loneliness because they know they are not alone in their journey. The man in the story, on his morning walks, came across a group of young people who were discussing their challenges in informal meetings in the park. He began participating as a listener and realized that many of them were experiencing the same kind of loneliness he had felt in his own youth. That generational exchange became a source of mutual learning. Furthermore, it is important to teach children and adolescents the difference between solitude and solitude. Solitude, the act of being alone by choice, can be enriching and healthy. When young people learn to enjoy moments of solitude, they develop emotional resilience that helps them cope better with loneliness. This can start with simple activities like keeping a journal, exploring a hobby, or even meditating. Finally, creating welcoming environments at home and at school is essential. It's not just about avoiding bullying or exclusion, but about cultivating a culture of empathy where everyone feels seen and valued. Loneliness, although universal, does not have to be an experience of prolonged suffering. For every child or teen who feels disconnected, there is an opportunity to help them build a future where they know they belong. The man in the story realized this when reflecting on his own life. He wondered how his journey would have been different if, as a young man, he had learned to deal with loneliness in a healthier way. This realization motivated him to help others, especially young people, find ways to turn loneliness into something that empowers them rather than consumes them. Loneliness, whether in childhood, old age, or anywhere in between, reminds us that we are all, in essence, beings in need of connection. And by learning to face loneliness in ourselves, we can also become a bridge for others who are still trapped in this maze. Man's journey ends here, but the learning continues, showing that even in the shadows, there is always room for light.